everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. So my name is Myles. I'm CEO and co-founder of a company called Globacap. We are, well, you probably haven't heard of us, so let me give you a very quick background. Started the company, in fact, I'm going to talk to you today about tokenization within European law of registered securities. And I'll talk about what registered securities are and why that's important, and ultimately what the implications of that are for capital markets worldwide. So first off, I started the company 4 years ago with the view that private capital markets are broken and in the technological dark ages. Using blockchain, we changed that. And the way that we changed that was by building out a digital ecosystem right across the full spectrum of private capital markets, from register management, where we digitized the security itself, the share or debt instrument, right across the full workflow of private placement and investing funds into companies and projects, and through to secondary liquidity, which is really where that piece of technological dark ages really exists in private capital markets before that. To date, we have $7 billion of private shares and debt instruments managed in our ecosystem for 3,000 investors. Companies have run 45 placements using our automated workflow, and we have spun up 4 white labels for institutions such as the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. We are an FCA-regulated entity in the UK as a securities arranger and custodian of cash and securities. We have 56 employees, we've raised $16 million of our own funding to date, and we founded the company 4 years ago. So, first off, some definition points. Let's just bring everyone up to speed before we get into the really good stuff. What do we mean by securities? So it turns out there's a very clear European definition of what securities are under a piece of regulation called MiFID. And I'm simplifying a little bit, but that comes down to shares in companies, debt instruments, so corporate bonds, for example, depository receipts, and derivatives. You don't need to know necessarily what all that is, but collectively, we're talking about a $700 trillion market worldwide for all of those instruments. Second bit of background information. How do public markets currently function at a logistical level when a trade happens? So if you have 2 parties, a buyer and a seller, and they want to transact on a public market. They want to trade some shares on the Swiss exchange or on the LSE or on NASDAQ. They go to their broker, usually on their online trading account. Could be a person or an entity that's doing this. Those brokers have accounts at the trading venue, at the LSE, at NASDAQ, for example. When a match happens, when a trade is matched, it gets novated to what's known as a clearing counterparty, a CCP. That clearing counterparty is responsible for reducing risk in the system, and they do that by ensuring that both of those parties, those 2 brokers acting on behalf of the investors, have the relevant amount of cash and shares to be able to transact. Once that CCP is happy, the trade then gets transferred over to the Central Securities Depository. So there's the DTCC in the US, one Central Securities Depository. There's CREST in the UK. There's Euroclear for bonds in Europe. In Switzerland, SIX, the exchange, actually has a separate CSD that's all part of the SIX group, but it operates independently. And what a CSD is essentially like a bank that has accounts, but it doesn't lend anything out. It basically has safe deposit boxes digitally for securities and for cash. And those are operated by big custodians such as State Street and Bank of New York Mellon, 2 of the biggest in the world. And the CSD then does what's known as delivery versus payment, or DVP. And it essentially takes the securities out from one custody account and puts it in the other, and takes the cash out from the other securities account for the custody account and puts it into the other. And so what ends up happening is you now have State Street in this example holding the shares that investor A bought, and Bank of New York Mellon holding the cash that investor B received for selling those shares. And that DVP process is one of the most heavily regulated processes in capital markets today. Okay, so now that all sounds kind of complicated, and there are lots and lots of moving parts and hundreds of thousands of employees that work in that clearing and settlement space. But the reality is it's actually very efficient. Transaction costs for that whole process of clearing and settlement are less than 1 basis point per transaction on average. In other words, less than 0.01%. It's incredibly efficient. And that's gotten that way over many, many, many decades of process refinement and improvement. That's public markets today. Private markets, on the other hand, are catastrophic. So what normally happens in private markets, people go out, they want to try and sell their shares in a private company that's not trading on an exchange anywhere. So they go to their local broker and they say, hey, can you find me a counterparty to buy these shares? And those brokers normally talk to each other, and then it's very opaque, and they charge ridiculous fees in the process. That's what happens today. Now, in the last 10 years, there have been a few private markets exchanges for shares that have sprung up. The two biggest in the world are in the United States, and they are NASDAQ Private Market and a group called Forge, which itself, incidentally, weirdly, has just become a private company through an SPAC acquisition. So they now transact several billions of dollars a year in private share transactions. But there is a problem. So all of that, what is actually an efficient process, even though it involves hundreds of thousands of people, of clearing and settlement in public markets, does not exist in private markets. So when a transaction happens on one of these exchanges right now, the two investors have to themselves, between them, with no exchange helping them, figure out a contract to agree terms of that actual transaction that's going to happen. Obviously, the buyer doesn't just want to hand over cash until they're sure they're going to get the shares transferred in their name. So they need some sort of cash custody somewhere, and they pay someone to do that. They need the actual legal title transfer, which involves several steps, depending on the country you're in, what those steps are. There needs to be a new share certificate issued, or in the case of, for example, Germany, a notary to notarize the transaction, a stamp duty paid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So normally, these transactions take, at best, a few weeks, usually a couple of months. It's a bit ridiculous. It's kind of madness. So we all have, many people here are probably involved in security tokenization in some form or have been exposed to it. And the big promise of security tokenization is, as we may know, is basically that you can tokenize the cash and tokenize the shares, have a smart contract sitting in the middle, put the cash, the digital cash, into the smart contract, put the shares into the smart contract, and when the smart contract is happy that it's there, it reverses it out and sends it back to the other participants, right? Great? Actually, not so great, and I'm going to tell you why. There is a concept of a bearer versus a registered instrument. So, all security tokenization to date has been done as a bearer process. And at first glance, you might think that's a good thing. Let me tell you what a bearer instrument versus a registered security actually is. So if this clicker for the PowerPoint slides had value, and it has some value, and it were a bearer instrument, then me holding it right now, as the bearer of it, I am the owner. And if I handed it to someone else, then they would be the bearer. So a coin, a banknote, these are bearer instruments. A crypto token is absolutely a bearer instrument. You send it to someone, they're the new owner. Done. A registered instrument, on the other hand, is where there is a registered list somewhere, a centralized list. Shock horror, centralization. But there are some reasons why this is good sometimes. Take, for example, your home ownership. There is a land registry in every country that contains a list of home and land owners. Now, if your home were a bearer instrument, let's think through that a little bit. Let's say you spend a lot of money on a brand new, amazing house, and you're in your house and you go out for a walk one day. And on the way, you drop your key, your house key. Someone else comes along, a bad actor as it were, picks up your house key, and goes into your house. Your house is a bearer instrument. They are now the owner of your house. Probably not too happy. Does that make sense? If you wouldn't want your house as a bearer instrument, why would you want your company as a bearer instrument? Or the shares in your company that you've built over time and spent all of your hard work and dedication building? Turns out that this thought process is not new. The first shares that were created on the Amsterdam Exchange to trade publicly a couple of hundred years ago were bearer instruments. A lot of securities created a couple of hundred years ago and traded publicly were bearer instruments. And over the last couple of hundred years, the world actually realized, through a lot of trial and error, that bearer instruments actually have a lot of downfall. They have some not so good sides to them, as shown above. And that's why today, most of the securities, the 700 trillion odd securities in the world, including derivatives, are registered instruments. And all of the regulation that's been built up around the world are based around registered instruments. It's not because people want to have centralized entities, it's because it's actually better in some cases. So with all of that in mind, when we started the company, we entered the regulatory sandbox in the UK, and we set out to create a truly digital shareholding that conformed within existing law. Unlike a security token where in the US, for example, they've been trying to create new law to fit this new category of security tokenization. Actually, we already have a very well-defined securities framework, and so we set out to create a truly digital version of that. So let's start off by defining what that actually means. If you were to turn up to a court of law, and I'm going to use the UK as an example because that's where we started, even though we progressively moved outwards to different countries, and it turns out most countries are broadly similar. So if we were to turn up at a court of law, and the judge were presented with two persons, one of which is saying, I own these shares, and the other person is saying, no, you don't, then what would the judge look at? And it turns out in the UK, they look at four distinct things. Number one, there's a share register of the company. And that share register is that list, like the land registry, that contains specific information. And every country has, in its own legislation, a very prescribed set of data that needs to be included in that share register. Second, there are filings. Most countries have these in some variety. In Germany, as an example, it's actually just the case of a notary stamping a document. In the UK, there is a central authority called Companies House, and every company must do an annual filing of the share list of the shareholder list of that company. Second, or third rather, there needs to be a provable transfer of funds. So in other words, the person who's claiming that they own the shares has to have shown that they've bought them at some point and has to show a transaction record of that transfer. And lastly, this depends on the country. In the UK, there is a legal requirement to have a share certificate. So, we took that first component, the share register, and we created a distributed ledger which encompassed all of the legal requirements that went in to constitute that share register. And that included certain functionality that otherwise required a human to do, such as a minimum holding period check, something really simple. So if someone were saying that today, on the 29th of October, they wanted to sell their shareholding that's recorded in that share register, but it turns out there's a minimum holding period until July next year, then the share register itself, in its technological digital form, declines that transaction. At a future date, when the share register deems that it approves a transaction, then it also initiates the filings that are required and the regeneration of share certificates to conform with existing regulations. So a truly end-to-end digital process. The cash is okay to track. Tokens are obviously better, and if we get to see, central bank digital currency, well, that's even better because then it's truly stable and we can have everything completely tracked on chain. This is where it gets really, just before that, just to highlight, this is not theoretical. We've got over $7 billion of securities in this form already to date for 80 companies and 3,000 investors. So this is where it gets really cool. Because let's add in a tokenization layer now. So with Tezos, we built out a public tokenization overlay, which essentially creates public tokens that are linked directly to the underlying distributed ledger. And that means that that token can be transferred between two parties, but because this is a registered instrument, that public token itself has a whitelist that ensures its own KYC compliance. It checks that with the underlying registered list in distributed ledger, and when a party is deemed safe, they're added to that public token, that whitelist. And when that transaction happens, it automatically updates the distributed ledger behind the scenes, the private chain, which in turn regenerates share certificates, does any filings, pays any stamp duty in the UK that's required, and so on, to ensure that legal settlement finality has occurred. That token can also be transferred to any number of digital exchanges. Now, just to be clear, there are no truly functioning digital exchanges in Europe yet. There are a number which are in progress. Obviously, the SDX is a big project in Switzerland. There's one called Archax in Europe, which is smaller, but in the process of getting regulatory authorization. I think in the next 12 months, we'll start to see these up and running. They've been in the works for quite a while. So what does all of this mean for private markets and public markets worldwide? There are an enormous amount of funds traded in, and securities traded in public markets globally that are fairly centralized. Public markets tends to be the pinnacle of mature companies that have already innovated and have come to market and listed their shares or debt instruments. Between shares and corporate debt, excluding government bonds, excluding derivatives, there's $110 trillion worth of securities in public markets globally. If you add in government bonds, that's another 100 trillion or so. And if you add in derivatives, that's another 500 trillion or so. Private markets, on the other hand, are $9 trillion today, approximately. And they operate in a very decentralized manner because of everything I've said earlier. However, private markets is where the true innovation happens. When companies are smaller, when they're mid-sized, when they're small-sized, that's where the real innovation happens, and that actually forms the greater portion of employment in our world, in smaller companies, not public companies. So what we're actually going to see as a result of the technological innovation that we've done, but also the technological innovation that's happening across tokenization world and across security tokenization world, is a very significant shift from public markets to private markets. Because the limiting factor in private markets to date has been the access to liquidity. And so with that route to simple liquidity, highly efficient liquidity, it reduces the risk premium that's associated with private markets for institutional investors. Therefore, they're able to allocate a greater portion of their portfolio from public to private markets. This is a monumental shift. And it's going to change quite dramatically the way that our world truly operates. Thank you very much.